The sound arrived before the shape did. It came from the east, low and rhythmic, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated in the sternum before it registered in the ears. In the parking lot of the Millbrook Commons Shopping Center, a Tuesday morning in October was proceeding along its ordinary lines. A woman pushing a stroller, a delivery driver unloading boxes, a teenager on a phone, when the sound grew large enough to make people stop and look up. The Black Hawk cleared the tree line at the eastern edge of the lot at an altitude of perhaps 200 feet. It was not alone. Behind it came a second helicopter, unmarked and dark. Below, on Harbor Street, 3 black SUVs with federal plates had materialized as if assembled from the morning air, and behind them, 2 Virginia State Police cruisers ran their lights in silence. Diane Hargrove stood in front of Diane's atelier, the boutique she had owned for 11 years, still holding her phone aloft. She had been filming. She had been, 30 seconds ago, the most powerful person in this parking lot. She had been laughing. The helicopter descended into the open space at the center of the lot. The rotor wash hit like a physical wall. Shopping bags tore from people's hands, a newspaper stand toppled, a woman's carefully arranged hair became suddenly irrelevant. The Black Hawk touched down with a precision that suggested the pilot had done this in places far less accommodating. The door opened. A man in a dark suit with a Pentagon identification badge climbed out first. Then a woman in army dress uniform, full colonel's insignia. Then 2 more men whose build and posture announced their profession without the need for any uniform at all. They walked directly across the parking lot. Not toward Diane. Toward the skinny young woman sitting against the wall of the dollar store, wearing a gray hoodie with a torn sleeve, cradling a paper cup that had held coffee an hour ago. The young woman looked up. She was not surprised. She stood, tucked something into her jacket with practiced efficiency, and said something to the woman sitting beside her, a younger girl with wide dark eyes, before she turned to meet the approaching group. The colonel extended her hand first. "Dr. Chun, mission complete. Sir sends his regards." The young woman in the torn hoodie shook it. Diane Hargrove's phone was still raised, but she had stopped filming 3 seconds ago, and she didn't know why, except that her hands had gone cold. 30 seconds ago, she had called this woman trash. Sarah Chun had been cold for so long that she had stopped registering it as a sensation and had reclassified it as a fact of the world, the way gravity is a fact, the way Tuesday follows Monday. It was simply a condition of existence, ambient and non-negotiable. She woke at 5:47 a.m. on the morning of October 14th in the alcove behind the dry cleaners on Sycamore Street, which faced north and received no direct sunlight and smelled permanently of chemical solvent. She had slept in worse places. She had slept in a mountainside ditch in the Karangal Valley with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and she had slept on the floor of a shipping container in the port of Busan while a man with a knife stood 3 feet away and didn't find her. The dry cleaner's alcove was, by comparison, almost pleasant. She did not stretch or yawn or check her phone the way civilians did, armoring themselves in their first waking moments with the soft light of a screen. She came awake completely and immediately, the way a machine comes online, every sensor operational. She listened first. She assessed the ambient sound of the street, a garbage truck 2 blocks east, a dog that had been barking since 4 a.m. and had changed its cadence in the last 20 minutes, suggesting its owner had finally moved it inside, a car idling on the corner that had been there since at least midnight. She noted the idling car. She had noted it last night. Same make, same position, engine cut and restarted twice in the intervening hours. Either a surveillance team or an anxious teenager. She filed it. She stood, re-rolled the thermal sleeping bag that was the single most expensive item in her visible inventory. Everything else she owned in this life was deliberately cheap, worn, and forgettable, and tucked it into the canvas duffel bag beside her. To the casual eye, she was a young homeless woman making her bed. To a more careful eye, she was moving with a speed and economy of motion that didn't match the role. Nobody looked carefully at homeless women. That was the foundation of the entire operation. She was 28 years old. She held a Ph.D. in political geography from Georgetown University, which she had completed at 24, while simultaneously completing her second year as a commissioned intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency. She spoke Mandarin, Arabic, Farsi, Korean, and functional Russian. She had been embedded in 3 previous long-term operations in 2 foreign countries and 1 domestic territory. She had been awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal and 2 classified commendations, none of which appeared on any public record. She was, in the language of her organization, a Tier 1 asset, which was another way of saying that the government had invested approximately $4 million in training her and would prefer she not get killed. None of this was visible when she stood outside the dry cleaners at 5:53 a.m., wearing a second-hand gray hoodie with a torn left sleeve, jeans that were 2 sizes too large, and a pair of Timberland boots she had selected because they were warm, durable, and common enough to disappear into any social context. She walked 2 blocks north, turned left on Harbor Street, and stopped at the chain-link fence at the edge of the public park, where a gap in the fence had been a community secret for a decade. Through it, she crossed the park to the pavilion, where Elena Santos was sitting on a picnic table with her knees pulled to her chest and her dark eyes watching the entrance. Elena Santos was 24 years old and had been living on the streets of Millbrook for 7 months. She had come here from Richmond with a boyfriend who had turned out to be a recruiter, not the corporate kind. She had escaped before the process was complete, which was an extraordinary piece of luck that she did not yet understand the full dimensions of. Sarah had found her in March, identified her as someone who could be leveraged or hurt, and made a quiet, unilateral decision to keep her close. It was not part of the mission parameters. "Did you eat?" Sarah asked. Elena nodded, holding up half a granola bar. "Sister Agatha's van came by at 5. "Good." Sarah sat on the bench and opened her duffel, extracting a small, dense object wrapped in a paper napkin. A breakfast sandwich she had purchased the evening before from the gas station on Route 9, where the overnight clerk was a 22-year-old nursing student named Priya, who had taken to slipping Sarah an extra item whenever she came in. Sarah held it out. "You should." "I ate earlier," Sarah said, which was not quite true. She was running on approximately 1,600 calories a day, which was below her operational baseline and was one of several small sacrifices she had made to ensure the cover felt authentic. Real hunger was different from performed hunger. She needed her body to tell the truth. Elena took the sandwich without further argument. She had learned, in the 7 months of their friendship, that Sarah was not going to be negotiated with on matters of this kind. "Today?" Elena asked. It was a code they had developed, not a formal one, just the organic shorthand of proximity. "Close," Sarah said. She meant it. Diane Hargrove had driven to Diane's atelier every morning for 11 years in a white Lexus RX 350, and she had never, not once in 11 years, entered through the back. The back was for deliveries. The back was for the part-time stock girl whose name Diane perpetually misremembered. The front was for Diane, and the front involved parking in the space closest to the door, which technically required a permit, but which Diane occupied regardless, because she paid taxes in this town, and she knew the parking commissioner's wife personally. She arrived at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, October 14th, in the white Lexus, in the permit space, wearing a camel-colored coat that had cost $3,200 and an expression that those who knew her had learned to recognize as her management face. Chin elevated slightly, lips compressed, eyes performing an assessment of everything within range. The assessment was not kind. The strip mall at Millbrook Commons was, in Diane's view, suffering from a persistent aesthetic problem: the homeless. Specifically, the 2 or 3 individuals who rotated through the area on a weekly basis, sitting near the entrance to the dollar store or the pharmacy, sometimes holding handwritten signs, sometimes simply existing in a way that Diane found aggressively inconsiderate of the shopping experience she had spent 11 years cultivating. She had complained to the city council. She had complained to the police. She had complained to the property management company. The results had been unsatisfying, which Diane attributed to the fact that her husband, despite being on the city council, was apparently incapable of leveraging his position for anything that directly benefited her, a failure she considered a character flaw. She saw the girl against the dollar store wall the moment she stepped out of the Lexus. Thin. Too thin. Hoodie. Cup. Diane felt a familiar tightening sensation that she would have described, if asked, as civic concern, but which her therapist, whom she no longer saw, because the therapist had begun making observations Diane did not find productive, would have described differently. She had things to do. She had a shipment of fall pieces arriving at 11. She had a lunch with Carolyn Marsh at 12:30. She had a phone call with her daughter's school at 2. She walked toward the girl anyway. Sarah saw Diane Hargrove coming from approximately 40 feet away. She had been aware of Diane Hargrove for 4 months. Not initially as a target, but as a behavioral constant in the environment. A woman who moved through the commons with the proprietary confidence of someone who considered public space a personal possession, who made regular contact with homeless individuals in the area in a way that was reliably unpleasant, who seemed to understand herself as a community guardian performing a necessary service when she told people to leave. She had assessed Diane as civilian, no direct operational relevance, no threat potential. Robert Hargrove, the husband, the councilman, was a thread in the network. Diane was simply a woman who was unkind, which was not Sarah's department. She watched Diane approach and ran a quick, involuntary assessment of the morning variables. Lisa Park's news van was parked at the far end of the lot. Lisa was doing a segment on the new pharmacy opening, and her cameraman had been setting up since 8:30. 3 civilians with phones visible. Officer Danny Kowalski was on foot patrol, currently half a block west on Harbor Street. Sarah looked down at her cup. The primary rule of undercover work was the same as the primary rule of method acting. You did not break character for comfort. You broke character only when breaking it served the mission, and then you broke it completely and with full commitment. For everything else, you stayed in the scene. Diane stopped 3 feet in front of her. You again. Diane's voice had a particular quality, not loud, but precisely projected, designed to be heard by an audience she had already located in her peripheral vision. I've seen you here every week for months. Every time I come to open my store, here you are. Sarah looked up. She arranged her face into the expression she had developed for these encounters. Mild, slightly unfocused, without challenge. The face of someone who has learned that challenging the wrong person costs more than it returns. Sorry, she said. Her voice was soft, lightly roughened. Sorry. Diane repeated the word like she was holding it up to light and finding it insufficient. You know what I am sorry about? I'm sorry that people like you think it's acceptable to sit here and ruin the environment for everyone else. This is a shopping center. It's a place of business. People come here to shop. They do not come here to be accosted by. She gestured vaguely at all of Sarah. This. I'm not accosting anyone, Sarah said, still quiet. You're begging. You're sitting there with your cup out, and you're begging, and it's disgusting. Diane's voice had risen a register. From the corner of her vision, Sarah observed that Lisa Park had turned from the pharmacy entrance. Lisa's cameraman had not yet moved, but Lisa had her phone out. There are jobs. There are resources. There are shelters. There is absolutely no excuse. Ma'am, I haven't asked you for anything, Sarah said. Don't interrupt me. The precision of Diane's offense at being interrupted, as if this was the single actionable violation in the exchange, was almost impressive. I am telling you, and I am telling everyone who does this, that it is a choice. You choose to sit here. You choose not to work. You choose to make other people's lives worse so you can take the easy way. It is pathetic, and it is lazy, and frankly, she leaned fractionally forward. It is disgusting. Stop begging and get a job. You are trash. Absolute trash. The word landed with the weight Diane intended. Sarah felt it the way you feel a minor impact when you are wearing body armor. You register it. You log it. It does not penetrate. She said nothing. She looked at Diane Hargrove's face, which was flushed with the particular satisfaction of someone who has said aloud the thing they believe and found the world agreeing to reflect it back to them. She noticed 3 things in the aftermath of Diane's speech. First, Lisa Park was filming. Not with the news camera, with her phone, angled from the side, steady and practiced. Second, Officer Danny Kowalski had turned the corner onto Harbor and was standing still, watching, his expression a careful neutral that could not conceal the discomfort underneath it. Third, Elena Santos had emerged from the gap in the chain-link fence at the park entrance and was standing very still, her dark eyes moving between Sarah and Diane with a fear in them that Sarah recognized. It was the fear of someone who understood exactly how badly this kind of encounter could go, not from civic sensibility, but from direct experience. Sarah made a decision. She looked at Diane Hargrove, and she said, with a quietness that was somehow worse than any raised voice, "You should go open your store, ma'am." Diane blinked. Something in the tone, the absolute absence of wounded feeling that she had been expecting, the clinical evenness of it, made her pause. Then she turned and walked back toward Diane's atelier, her camel coat catching the October wind, her head high. Sarah looked across the lot at Officer Kowalski. He met her eyes and looked away first. She looked at Lisa Park, who had lowered her phone but was still watching. She picked up her paper cup and waited. By 11 a.m., Lisa Park's 22-second video clip had been viewed 140,000 times. By 3 p.m., it had been viewed 4 million. By the time the sun set on Millbrook, Virginia, "Stop Begging and Get a Job, Trash" was trending in 17 states. The briefing room was on the 4th floor of a building in Crystal City that had no sign and required 2 separate biometric clearances to enter. It contained a table, 6 chairs, a classified display screen, and, on the morning of April 8th, for people, Colonel James Whitfield, 2 analysts Sarah did not know by name, and Sarah herself. She had been back in the country for 11 days, having completed a 14-month embedded operation in Southeast Asia that she was not going to discuss in this briefing or, arguably, ever. She had lost 9 pounds she hadn't had to spare, and she had a persistent cough that the base physician had cleared but that still visited her at 2 a.m. sometimes. She had been expecting leave. She had been expecting 3 months minimum. Operation Hollow Ground, Colonel Whitfield said, and the screen lit up with a geographic map of Virginia. The operation, as Whitfield laid it out, was not small. Over the preceding 18 months, 3 separate federal agencies, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the DIA, had developed independent intelligence suggesting that a mid-level city government in Virginia was the operational hub of a trafficking network that had moved, conservatively, 212 individuals across state lines over 4 years. The network used legitimate government infrastructure, city contracts, registered nonprofits, a private shuttle company licensed through the city, to move people. Money flowed back through campaign finance, property transactions, and a web of LLCs with connections to individuals who had connections that extended to people the U.S. government found very interesting. The problem was evidence. Every attempted conventional approach, wiretap, informant, financial audit, had encountered a leak. Someone inside the agencies feeding information to the Hargrove network. The solution, Whitfield said, was an approach outside conventional agency channels. Someone who didn't appear on any interdepartmental roster. Someone whose presence in the environment would not register. A homeless person, Sarah said. A homeless person, Whitfield confirmed, without apology. There was a silence. "You don't have to do this," Whitfield said, and Sarah recognized from long experience that this was a formality, that the "you don't have to" in this context meant, we don't have anyone else whose profile fits and whose judgment we trust completely. "Who's my handler?" she asked. "Webb." She knew Marcus Webb. She trusted Marcus Webb. Webb operated a food truck on Harbor Street, which gave him a reason to be in the area every day and a reason to know every person who passed through the Commons. 6 months, she said. Ideally 4, Whitfield said. 6 at the outside. She looked at the map for a long moment. She thought about 212 people. She thought about what conservative estimate meant in that sentence. "I need a week," she said. She used the week to run 11 miles a day, read everything in the mission package, memorize Millbrook Street grid, and call her sister in Portland, who believed Sarah worked in government data analysis and who had not seen her in 14 months. "You sound tired," her sister said. "I'm okay," Sarah said. "I'll call you soon." On April 15th, she drove to Millbrook in a rental car, parked it in long-term storage at the airport in Charlottesville, took a bus that stopped 6 miles outside of town, and walked the rest of the way in. She did not look like a government asset when she arrived. She looked like a young woman who had run out of options. The network worked as follows. Robert Hargrove, city councilman for District 4, controlled 4 city contracts: a waste management contract, a public transportation supplement contract, a parks maintenance contract, and an emergency housing assistance contract. None of these were unusual. All of them were legitimate on paper. The emergency housing assistance contract was administered through a nonprofit called Millbrook Community Bridge, whose executive director was a man named Arthur Penfield, who reported to a board of directors whose most significant member was a private citizen named Douglas Reeve, who did not appear in any public records connected to the Hargrove political network, but whose phone records, legally obtained as part of a parallel FBI investigation that Sarah was not officially part of, but whose results were fed to her handler through a classified relay, showed 231 calls with Robert Hargrove's personal cell phone over the preceding 2 years. Douglas Reeve had interests in private transportation. Sarah's job was to document the mechanism by which vulnerable individuals were identified, assessed, and funneled from Millbrook Community Bridge into the transportation network. She did this the way she did most difficult things, methodically, patiently, and without emotion. She became a regular presence at the Community Bridge intake desk. She attended 2 orientation sessions, in which a counselor named Brad explained available resources with an enthusiasm that was slightly too practiced. She observed which individuals from those sessions received follow-up calls and which did not. She observed that the follow-up calls came from a number not registered to Community Bridge. She documented 11 individuals over a 3-month period who attended intake and subsequently vanished from Millbrook's shelter population without any documented placement in housing. She documented the license plates of vehicles that idled outside Community Bridge on intake days. She noted the same 2 plates appearing consistently. She photographed them using a method that involved nothing more sophisticated than the second-hand smartphone she carried, which appeared to be broken but was not, and whose data was transmitted to Marcus Webb daily through a protocol they had established using the food truck's Wi-Fi. She found Elena Santos in month 2, assessed her as a near miss of the trafficking intake process, and made the decision to keep her close. Elena knew nothing specific about what Sarah was doing, but her proximity was itself intelligence. Elena knew the ecosystem, knew the names, had overheard things. Sarah listened and remembered. By September, she had enough for an indictment. By October, she had enough for a prosecution. On the morning of October 14th, she was waiting for one final piece. A financial transaction that would connect Douglas Reeve's transportation company to Robert Hargrove's personal accounts in a way that was direct, clean, and courtroom-ready. Marcus had told her, at their morning signal exchange, a pattern of how he arranged the condiment bottles on the food truck counter, visible from the park, that the financial documents were expected to clear Federal Relay by noon. She was waiting. She had been waiting in the parking lot of Millbrook Commons when Diane Hargrove arrived in her white Lexus. Robert Hargrove had not been a bad man when Diane married him. She had thought about this, occasionally, in the quiet moments of their marriage, in the way that people sometimes excavate the foundational premises of their lives and feel briefly vertiginous before filling the excavation in again and walking away. He had been a county planner, then, smart, ambitious, handsome in a reliable, Midwestern way that suggested competence and modest success. He had run for city council when their daughter was 3, and he had won, and winning had done something to him that Diane had watched happen gradually enough that no single moment seemed alarming. Now he was on his 3rd term, and he moved through the city with the ease of a man who understood its mechanisms precisely, not with civic pride, but with the proprietary ease of ownership. He made calls that produced results. He had relationships whose nature Diane had stopped inquiring about, because the answers were unsatisfying in different ways than she expected. Not scandalous, just small. Just the daily arithmetic of traded favors and manageable debts that she suspected most people in his position accumulated and which seemed, she told herself, harmless. She did not know about Community Bridge. She did not know about Douglas Reeve. She did not know that the money that funded the renovations of their kitchen 3 years ago, which Robert had described as coming from an investment account, had in fact traveled a longer and less straightforward path to get there. What she knew was that her husband answered certain calls in another room. What she knew was that he had voted twice against a proposed city audit that she'd never been able to get him to explain adequately. What she knew was that sometimes, in the evenings, he sat in his study with a glass of scotch and looked at the middle distance with an expression she had learned not to ask about. She had constructed around this knowledge a comfortable architecture of non-inquiry, and she maintained it the way she maintained everything in her life, with energy and with the particular kind of will that is indistinguishable from denial. She came home on the evening of October 14th to find that her video had been viewed 7 million times, and that the comments were not going the way she had expected. She had expected, as she usually did when she was clearly in the right, for the world to agree with her. The world was not agreeing with her. She sat at the kitchen island with her laptop and scrolled through the comments with growing incomprehension, the way someone walks into a room expecting one season and finds another. The girl in the video was being described, by strangers who did not know her, with words like dignified and patient and restrained. Diane herself was being described with words she did not want to document here. "Robert," she called. No answer. He was in his study with the door closed. The video changed the texture of the days that followed. People who had previously walked past Sarah with the ordinary urban non-acknowledgement now sometimes made eye contact, some with recognition, some with the brief warmth of proxy solidarity. One woman who stopped and asked if she needed anything and pressed a $20 bill into her hand before Sarah could decline. Diane Hargrove appeared in the parking lot on Thursday morning and again on Friday. She did not approach Sarah again, but she stood outside her boutique with her phone and made a call that lasted 11 minutes, and on Friday afternoon, a police cruiser came through the lot twice. Officer Danny Kowalski was not in the cruiser. The officers who were in it were not from his beat, and they had the particular quality of officers responding to a request from someone with social capital. Not hostile, exactly, but performing a presence that was meant to communicate that someone who mattered had placed a call. Sarah watched them drive through and did not move. On Saturday morning, she arrived at her usual position to find Elena sitting against the dollar store wall, pale and shaking, a bruise developing on her left cheekbone. Sarah sat down beside her and did not immediately ask. She waited. Elena breathed. "There was a man," Elena said finally. "Last night. At the shelter. He was looking for me specifically. He asked the night staff by description." Sarah's entire body was still. "Did anyone tell him anything?" "Sister Agatha said she didn't know me." Elena paused. She was lying, but she lied well. Good. Sarah calculated. The network had identified Elena as a loose end, someone who had slipped through the intake process and who was still in the area. This was, operationally, a problem. It meant the network was running maintenance checks, which meant they knew something had disturbed the water. It might mean they knew about the investigation. It might mean they were simply managing vulnerable inventory. Either way, Elena's timeline had moved. Sarah sent a coded signal to Marcus that evening. A specific arrangement of the items in her duffel bag left visible at the corner of the park that corresponded to a pre-established escalation protocol. The signal meant, accelerate extraction timeline for asset Elena Santos. Marcus received it. 3 hours later, a woman from a genuine nonprofit that Sarah had quietly arranged contact with 3 months ago as a contingency appeared at the shelter and, through Sister Agatha, connected with Elena. By Sunday morning, Elena was in a safe house in Richmond, in the care of an organization that didn't know why she had been sent to them and didn't need to. Sarah watched her go and felt something that she allowed herself to experience for approximately 45 seconds before she filed it and returned to work. She needed the financial documents. She needed them to clear. She needed this to be over. Marcus Webb had been running a food truck called Harbor Good Eats for 6 months, and his reviews on Yelp were, genuinely, excellent. He had not expected to become invested in the food truck. It was a cover, not a vocation, but somewhere around month 3, he had started caring whether the sandwiches were good, which was either a sign of professional dedication to authenticity or a sign that 6 months of undercover fieldwork had begun to blur certain boundaries. On Monday, October 13th, he received a relay transmission that contained the financial documents Sarah had been waiting for. Robert Hargrove, account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. 47 deposits over 18 months, corresponding exactly in date and amount to payments made by Reeve Transportation LLC, which was a subsidiary of a holding company that also owned the 2 vans Sarah had photographed outside Community Bridge. It was, as Marcus communicated to Colonel Whitfield in Crystal City, clean. Whitfield called a meeting that lasted 90 minutes. By the end of it, arrest warrants had been prepared for Robert Hargrove, Douglas Reeve, Arthur Penfield, Mayor Thomas Brennan, and 11 associated individuals. Coordination had been established with the FBI's Richmond Field Office, Homeland Security, the U.S. Marshals, and Virginia State Police. The question was timing. Sarah had specified, in her original mission parameters, that she wanted to be present at her own extraction, not simply pulled out quietly under darkness, but clearly and visibly, in the operational environment, for reasons she had explained to Whitfield in terms he had initially found unusual and then, upon reflection, understood. There are people in that community, she had written in the Mission Parameter Amendment, who have watched this play out for months and who have understood the social calculus of it. The extraction should be unambiguous. It should be public. It should not allow for an alternative narrative in which I simply disappeared. She meant Elena, in part. She meant the other vulnerable people she had watched move through Millbrook's margins over 6 months. People who needed to see something land, not just hear about it. Whitfield had approved it. He had also, because he was Whitfield, and because he had operated in environments where symbolism mattered, arranged the specific assets to be deployed with a characteristic economy of feeling. A Black Hawk helicopter. The real thing. Not a display, not a theatrical prop. The one that had brought her out of worse places than a Virginia parking lot. On the evening of October 13th, the signal bottle arrangement on Marcus's condiment rack told Sarah, tomorrow. She spent that night in the alcove behind the dry cleaners, and she slept well. At 9:04 a.m. on October 14th, Diane Hargrove pulled her white Lexus into the permit space in front of Diane's atelier. At 9:07, she saw Sarah Chun against the dollar store wall and walked toward her. At 9:08, she delivered the speech. It lasted, by Lisa Park's video timestamp, 44 seconds. At 9:09, Sarah told Diane to go open her store. At 9:23, Sarah's watch, which was a Casio G-Shock that had survived more field deployments than she could easily count, gave a single, barely perceptible vibration. The prearranged confirmation signal from Marcus. They're airborne. She stayed still. She breathed. She watched the morning. She watched a woman push a stroller across the lot. She watched the delivery driver argue pleasantly with his clipboard. She watched Lisa Park's cameraman begin packing up the segment equipment now that the pharmacy opening footage was done. She heard the helicopter at 9:31. She was on her feet at 9:32 because old habits were old habits, and the sound of a Black Hawk at approach altitude was a sound her body had opinions about that her mind was not entirely in charge of. She was standing, her hand resting on her duffel bag, watching the tree line when it cleared. Around her, the parking lot did what parking lots do when unexpected loud things happen from the sky. It first froze, then moved. People ducked, or backed against walls, or grabbed their children. The delivery driver stepped directly into a parking barrier and sat down hard on the pavement. A woman's latte went the way of all lattes. The second helicopter appeared above the tree line. On Harbor Street, the black SUVs were visible now, sliding into position with the unhurried confidence of vehicles that do not expect any obstacle to remain in place. The Black Hawk descended. Sarah stood in its rotor wash and let her hair come down, because she'd been wearing it in a practical bun for 6 months, and there was something privately satisfying about this specific piece of symbolism that she was willing to permit herself. The rotor noise compressed the air into something that felt solid. The tires touched the asphalt. The door opened. Colonel Rachel Marsh, Whitfield's second, who Sarah had served under in a previous existence, came out first, tall and certain, uniform immaculate, moving through the chaos of the rotor wash as if it were a perfectly ordinary hallway. Behind her came 2 DIA field agents in dark suits who had the quality of men who had spent time in places where the wrong move had permanent consequences. They walked toward Sarah, and the crowd, who had been uncertain about many things in the preceding 60 seconds, became certain about one. These people were walking with purpose, and the purpose had a destination, and the destination was the thin young woman in the torn gray hoodie who had been sitting against the dollar store wall. Diane Hargrove had come out of her boutique when the sound started. She had her phone up on instinct. She had been filming the helicopter, the SUVs, the general spectacular occurrence of the morning, with the assumption that this was an event happening to the parking lot, something external, something she might post about. She watched the colonel walk past her. She watched the colonel extend her hand to the girl. She watched the girl shake it. She heard, even over the fading rotor wash, the colonel say, "Dr. Chun. Mission complete. Sir sends his regards." Diane Hargrove lowered her phone. The next 45 minutes were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. They were administrative, and their administrative quality was, in some ways, more devastating than any theatrical production could have been. Sarah spoke briefly with Colonel Marsh, accepted a jacket and a secure phone with the automatic ease of someone resuming a familiar set of tools, and then turned to exchange 3 or 4 words with Officer Danny Kowalski, who had arrived on Harbor Street during the helicopter descent and who was standing with the particular frozen expression of a man who is rapidly recalibrating several months of social certainty. "You knew?" he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the involuntary output of a mind that had just been handed new information and was audibly processing the implications. "Not what I was doing specifically," Sarah said. "But you knew something wasn't right about the situation." Kowalski thought about this. He thought about the mornings he'd passed through the Commons and seen her and felt the thing he couldn't articulate, the sense that the visible information didn't account for the person. He thought about the morning, 2 months ago, when he'd watched the community bridge van slow down near her and then accelerate away, and how she hadn't seemed afraid, had just tracked the van with her eyes in a way that was too deliberate to be civilian. "The shelters," he said suddenly. "You were documenting community bridge." "I was," she said. "And your instinct about them was correct. You filed 2 incident reports that went nowhere. Those reports are in the prosecution file. Your name will be noted positively." Kowalski looked at her for a long moment. "I called her ma'am Hargrove when she filed the complaint about you. I called her and told her that there was nothing actionable," Sarah said. "I know. It was the right call for the information you had." He absorbed this. He nodded slowly, in the way of a man choosing to accept absolution. On the far side of the parking lot, a federal vehicle had pulled up to Diane's atelier. 2 agents in FBI jackets, the real FBI jackets, not the tactical vests from the television, were escorting a handcuffed Robert Hargrove through the front door of his wife's boutique, where he had been meeting with a contact whose name Sarah had provided in the previous evening's intelligence transmission. Diane saw this from where she stood. She saw her husband, in the front window of her shop, in handcuffs, between 2 federal agents. She turned to look at Sarah Chun, who was now wearing a different jacket and holding a secure phone, and who was, unmistakably and irreversibly, not the person Diane had believed her to be 45 minutes ago. "What is?" Diane started. Her voice had lost its precision. "What is happening?" Sarah did not look over immediately. She finished the sentence she was saying to Kowalski. Then she turned. She looked at Diane Hargrove with the same calm, unbothered attention she had turned on her 45 minutes ago in the parking lot. "Your husband is being arrested," Sarah said, "on federal charges including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, money laundering, and bribery of a public official. The same charges are being executed simultaneously on Mayor Brennan, Arthur Penfield, and 8 other associated individuals." She paused. "Community Bridge is being shut down. The individuals it processed are being located and supported." Diane's hand came up to her mouth. "The cup," she said, and then stopped. Sarah understood. The paper cup was a prop. "I don't take money. I'm a federal officer performing an undercover operation. You let me." Diane's voice cracked. She stopped, rebuilt something, started again. "You let me say those things." Sarah regarded her with an expression that was not unkind and not warm. "I was working. You were choosing." The distinction landed with audible precision. Diane Hargrove had spent 44 seconds in a parking lot that morning with a phone camera on her, performing a version of herself she had performed many times before in the confident expectation that the world would continue to reflect it back to her. The world had revised its position. "Her boutique finances," Sarah said, turning to one of the DIA agents, not because she was certain there was anything there, but because she had learned, from 6 months of studying the Hargrove household's cash flow, and from 2 months of noticing that Diane Hargrove drove a $63,000 car and wore coats from designers whose typical customer did not have a husband on a city councilman's salary, that the boutique's revenue had never quite seemed to account for the lifestyle. "Run it." She did not wait for acknowledgement. She turned toward the helicopter. The agent ran it. There was, it turned out, something there. There were other moments. Mayor Brennan, in his office 3 blocks away, watched the news coverage of his own arrest warrant being served in what his assistant would later describe as a state of complete paralysis. He had known, somewhere in the last 6 months, that something was wrong with the normal feel of the city. He had made calls. He had gotten no satisfying answers. He had told himself it was anxiety, the normal occupational paranoia of a man in his position. It was not anxiety. Douglas Reeve, founder of Reeve Transportation LLC, was arrested at his residence in a private community 40 minutes north of Millbrook, where the gates and the security cameras had seemed, until this morning, like adequate protection from consequences. Arthur Penfield, executive director of Millbrook Community Bridge, was arrested attempting to leave through the building's loading dock at the moment the front entrance team knocked. The loading dock team had been there first. It was a small, procedural humiliation that would never be mentioned in any official document, but that would live, with full clarity, in Penfield's personal recollection for the remainder of his life. In the parking lot of Millbrook Commons, Lisa Park was still filming. She was no longer filming on her phone. Her cameraman had the full rig on his shoulder and was tracking everything. And Lisa was doing what a good journalist does when the story suddenly becomes 10 times the story she came to cover. She was getting out of the way of it, letting it happen, catching as much as she could. She would win a regional Emmy for the coverage. She would also, in the segment that aired 5 days later, use 18 seconds of footage she had taken that morning before the helicopter arrived. Diane Hargrove, immaculate in the camel coat, delivering her speech to the thin woman in the torn hoodie, and the thin woman's face, not wounded, not afraid, just watching, and the 3 words she had said at the end. You should go open your store, ma'am. The tone in those 6 words. The absolute, comprehensive patience in them. Lisa had watched it 40 times before the broadcast, and still felt the same thing every time. The eerie, retrospective weight of not knowing what you were looking at. She was looking at a person who had already won. She just hadn't known it yet. Dr. Raymond Choi, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, arrived in Millbrook at 11:30 a.m. in a vehicle that attracted less attention than the Black Hawk had, which was appropriate since he was 62 years old and had spent his career being the least visible person in any room. He found Sarah in the Federal Command vehicle they had established at the edge of the parking lot. She was at a workstation, writing her final operational report with the focused efficiency of someone who has been composing the document in their head for 6 months. He sat across from her and waited. She finished the sentence she was writing. Then she looked up. Good work, he said. It was 2 words, and in the economy of Raymond Choi's professional vocabulary, it was equivalent to a standing ovation. The 212, she said. It was not a question. Outreach started this morning. 14 have already been located in partnership with law enforcement in 3 states. The figure is likely higher than initial estimates. We'll have a clearer picture in 72 hours. Sarah nodded. She looked down at the workstation. She thought about 212 people, which was the conservative estimate. I want to be briefed on every locate, she said. Choi said, that's outside protocol. I know, she said. She waited. He said, I'll have Webb coordinate the briefings. She went back to her report. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late November, Sarah Chun ran 11 miles along the C.O. Canal Trail outside Washington, D.C., in the cold gray light of a sky that couldn't decide between overcast and clearing. She ran in the efficient, deliberate way she did most things. Not fast enough to be showing off, not slow enough to be casual. The pace of a person conducting a specific transaction with their own body and keeping careful accounts. She had taken 3 weeks of leave, which she had spent in Portland with her sister, eating her sister's cooking and sleeping 10 hours a night, and being persistently, patiently interrogated about what exactly she did for the government, to which she had given answers that satisfied her sister in the way that a well-constructed, incomplete picture satisfies a person who trusts the artist. She had also, on the 2nd week, driven to Richmond and visited a community center where Elena Santos was staying temporarily, working with a resettlement counselor and taking an online course in medical billing. Elena had looked at her with the complicated eyes of someone who has had to revise their understanding of a person they thought they knew. You lied to me, Elena had said, eventually. I didn't tell you the truth, Sarah had said. Is that different? It was, for the mission. I'm sorry it didn't feel different. Elena had thought about this for a while. Then she'd said, the sandwich was real, though. Always, Sarah said. The Hargrove case had moved with the speed of cases that have a complete and well-documented evidence package and a federal prosecution team that has been waiting 6 months for the material to land. Robert Hargrove had retained counsel and was cooperating at a level that suggested he had done rapid arithmetic about his situation and had arrived at an answer he didn't like. Penfield had flipped inside 48 hours. Mayor Brennan, who had spent 40 years in Virginia politics and had the instincts of a man who had survived in that environment by calculating odds accurately, had secured a plea agreement within the week. Diane Hargrove had not been charged with a crime. Her boutique finances had revealed irregularities that were, technically, Robert's doing rather than hers. She had signed documents without appearing to understand what they contained, which her lawyer argued was evidence of ignorance rather than culpability, and the federal prosecutors had other priorities. She was not indicted. She closed Diane's atelier in the second week of November. She made a statement on social media that a communications professional had clearly written, because it had none of the precision of her normal voice. All the edges sanded down, nothing that could be weaponized, a portrait of a woman who had been deceived and who was taking time to reflect. It was received by the internet with the particular skepticism reserved for apologies that apologize for circumstances rather than actions, and then the internet moved on, as it does. The video remained, of course. 44 seconds. Diane in the camel coat. Sarah's face. You should go open your store, ma'am. What struck people, when they watched it now with the subsequent knowledge of who Sarah was, of what she had been sitting there building for 6 months, of the helicopter coming and the handcuffs and all of it, was what struck Lisa Park every time she watched it. The absolute stillness in Sarah's face. The quality of someone who is in possession of a different and more comprehensive picture of the situation. The quality of patience that is possible only when you know, with certainty, that the morning has an afternoon. There was something in that stillness that people found, not comforting, exactly, because it was too costly a stillness to be comfortable, too hard-earned. But something. A reminder that beneath every surface of powerlessness there might be a complexity the observer hasn't been patient enough to find. That the category of trash is a failure of observation. That the hierarchies we perform with such conviction in parking lots and boutiques and offices and comment sections are built on what we can see, and what we can see is almost never everything. Sarah finished her 11 miles and stopped at the water's edge, breathing evenly, watching the canal catch what light was available and do something modest and sufficient with it. She had 3 days before she was due back. She had a meeting on Monday with Whitfield about the next assignment, which she had been briefed on in broad strokes, and which she was already thinking about in the particular, methodical way she thought about problems that had many moving parts and required careful preparation. She was not a person who dwelled. She was a person who filed things and moved forward, who understood that the work was longer than any individual operation, that the 212 people who had been the point of the last 6 months were part of a larger number, and that the larger number had its own logic and its own demand. But she allowed herself, standing at the canal in the November light, one moment. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about the paper cup in her hand, and the rotor wash, and the colonel's handshake. She thought about Elena's face as the safe house car pulled away, and she thought about 44 seconds of video that had made the world briefly stop and look at something it usually preferred not to see. She thought about what it meant to carry something for a long time, and to carry it quietly, and to trust that the weight of it was justified. She turned and started back down the trail. She had work to do.